Welcome to Property Quorum. As ever, we're joined by at least some of the stalwarts today. Some people appear to be doing lots of work. Thankfully, Juliet Babulal of Gunnercook, a faithful paralegal Karishma Carrier from Gunnercook as well, and of course, our man in the woods, Hamish McClay, is here to help us get through this. Today, we're talking about due diligence, specifically in the fact that there have been a lot of legislative, I always managed to say the word there, changes over the last year, and I suspect plenty more to come. As ever, and as traditional here, I'm going to throw Hamish straight under the bus.
Two things. I mean, welcome to the new year, which is our first podcast of the new year that we have on Property Quorum. Chris Gilsonan has chosen to sort of, instead of braving himself with us, has put himself under the direct control of British Rail. So I trust his journey goes well for him.
Foolish.
No, you never quite know where they're going to take you when. However, I'm sure we'll see him back again next week.
It's a bit like flying with Ryanair, isn't it? You're never quite sure which airport you're going to land at.
Oh, well, I think we've got a London airport up here in Oxfordshire. I think they call it, I can't remember what they call it now, but but anyway, it's a little bit further outside of London than one would expect.
Right.
However, that isn't why we're here today. We're speaking about legislative changes, trying to carry out due diligence. Two things, funny, both came to my attention yesterday. And one of them was an American gentleman saying that the IRS documentation that they need to read through to be responsible for their own reporting of, this is to do, of course, with financial reporting in the IRS.
Yeah.
Covered over 500 pages. And because of the complexities that even the government didn't understand, each individual was held responsible. So they needed to themselves to understand it, even though the government couldn't. Now, we've got a situation coming up in the sort of what's happening in the UK. And this, again, was brought to my attention by somebody I know who does an awful lot of work in the House of Commons and the House of Lords as well, that every 2.5 days since something like the 5th of June, there has been something brought up within the House of Commons to do with property. Every 2.5 days. And you add to that every single week it would appear that from the statistics that there is a new QUANGO created. Now, of course, when we look at the way this, where property needs to be, something needs to happen within property. Now, I am sort of myself responsible. My own business is responsible for. We cover something approaching 70 councils, which is only about 25% of the councils in the UK. And, even though legislation does change and ownership changes, and it is easy enough for us to keep track of it because we've been doing it for 20 years. However, how on earth does somebody, and this is why it's so important that we've got both Karishma and Juliet here, speaking from a legal perspective, how on earth can you ensure due diligence? We look at this, and sorry about the longer introduction today, but I think it is important to look at certain aspects. The Building Safety Act, which celebrates its 3rd year this year, still is causing absolute mayhem. And we have got so many changes due to come through. Are they going to be coming through Parliament during this particular session? But it certainly looks as though they want to push them through in 2025. How on earth do you maintain due diligence throughout all of these changes going on?
It must be a nightmare, Juliet. You've got legal structure changes. Sorry, I'm not saying that word again. And then on top of that, you've got to maintain that due diligence to make sure that your clients are best served. It must be a nightmare for you.
Well, I mean, it's a balancing act. And there were two things that I pulled from Hamish's comments. One, these changes come into the fore, but are the government staff up to date in terms of the training that they actually need to have in relation to this? So, for example, you're a consumer and you're calling up the HMRC and you're saying, look, there's a new change here. There might be an exemption. Can you guide me in the right place? And they actually don't give you any guidance. They tell you, look, this is self-assessment. You are entitled to interpret it in the way that you choose to. But, ultimately, if you get that wrong, there's a penalty that comes. There is a price to pay if you get that wrong. So if the lawmakers or the ones who change law aren't fully aware of what these changes mean, how is the average consumer expected to understand these changes? So, that point you made about the IRS, Hamish, absolutely spot on. You've got to have a period in time where there is that training that happens, and then there is the implementation of that which you want to implement. So there's a smooth process. That hasn't happened. So, for example, when I look at due diligence as a lawyer, I'm looking at my clients. I need to make sure that they are who they say they are. I need to look at, for example, if I'm reporting on a security, I need to look at anything that might affect value. So for me, due diligence takes on a whole host of meanings, so to speak. But the way you keep up to date is, you apply to certain websites, you subscribe to websites, you subscribe to mail shots. And for the average consumer, I don't expect them to necessarily understand, as I said. So again, I go back to the point of finding the right professional who will be able to handhold and guide you. I mean, there are times when people will come to me and it's a really complicated tax structure and they claim this, that, and everything. I can read the rules, but I'm not a tax expert. I'm not an accountant. And so the reality is we've got to go and get advice from a tax expert. So if you're scared about the due diligence, half of that battle is actually won if you've chosen the right professional to take advice from. So that's something we've been harping on about, for a very long time, but that is fact. The due diligence bubble and what it entails is really mind-boggling for lawyers, let alone for the average consumer.
Well, I'm just going to I was going to introduce everyone to Karishma. Karishma, thank you very much for being here today. Now, obviously, you're a slightly different side of everything to Juliet. How does due diligence affect you?
I think for me, I have to be very proactive about things. So where Juliet's talking about sort of making sure the client is who they say they are, it's ensuring we have the correct ID on file. Is the ID up to date? Have we actually run a background check into their company? Is it performing as it's supposed to? Does this sort of transaction match up? Are we being duped? Are we being scammed in any way? I think you have to be incredibly proactive, and it's sort of listening to the news, finding out what's coming into effect, and then doing your own research into it. But it's the whole topic of this podcast right now is that it's ever changing. And, I was doing some research this morning, and you look at the right to rent, now we're having to tell landlords that, does your tenant actually have a right to rent in the UK? So now, as much as we're factoring ID due diligence and checking on that, we're now monitoring immigration laws. Has that changed? And I think we're slowly taking on so much that you have to be proactive and you have to make sure that you're keeping on top of things, because you can't function if you're not.
Wow. I didn't realize there was so much going on. Hamish, it appears to me that people are being pushed outside the normal boundaries of their work. Juliet and Krishna are being turned into immigration lawyers, amongst other things.
I think this is the complication of what's happening. I do absolutely feel for what Juliet and Karishma have to go through, and all of their other compatriots involved with sort of property law. Now, when we look at what is happening in the world of conveyancing, not everybody is a property lawyer. Not everybody has that full training, the full background. Juliet has gone through, and Karishma's sort of going through. So they are in a very, very difficult position to be able to answer some of these questions and to look after people fully effectively, which brings us down to this particular aspect. Are we working with the right people in order to guide us through? Is the river almost full of piranhas, sort of in some ways. Somebody wants a chunk from you, sort of here, there, and all over the place. How do you avoid all of those things going on and really sort of survive the tumult of actually sort of getting through the demands of what should be, what one hopes to be, that idea of sort of buying into a property, a bit more difficult when it's commercial, when you're looking for something for development. But even so, I just see in the 20 years I've been working and collaborating with conveyancing, I've just seen item after item after item. I'm fortunate in the last 12 months that we've been doing work of this particular nature, particularly Juliet. I'm finding out more and more about what's being loaded onto the backs of the legal profession in terms of what they're having to do. There's more and more pressure. And unfortunately, whereas we would like things to be able to happen without government information, we've even got things, there's going to be a big chase on shortly, of course. We haven't quite hit it yet, but it's moving through because we've got a change in the stamp duty, which sort of, which is going to impact, particularly on the residential side of things. So there's all sorts of stuff, and I really do. I don't know how on earth it is possible to keep adding to a situation, and there is an expectation from the general public that they don't have to pay as much as they're still looking to buy El Cheapo. Is that good money to get through this morass of all of these impositions that are actually sort of coming down? Has this been checked? Has that been just listening to Karishma there about the things she was checking up on? It's
it seems to be pushing her quite out of your original comfort zone. No offense, but nobody expected Karishma and Juliet to become experts in immigration law. But I suspect you have to take all that into account now. I quickly want to acknowledge that Laura Brown, who's been watching, apparently, I don't know if you're an old viewer or a new viewer. Lovely to have you on board. Thank you so much, and thank you for your feedback, and long may it continue. Let me just quick buzz back to Juliet. Juliet, it seems to me that you guys are being forced to perhaps expand your knowledge base into areas that you weren't necessarily focused on.
Yeah, it's moved away from law, and you're very much in the hot seat of a detective, because I've seen files go to PI insurers or go to the National Crime Agency, and things that you may not have picked up on gets picked up by them. And hindsight is a wonderful thing. But when you're busy and you're juggling and you're working through several files, it's very easy to miss something.
Right.
One of my biggest beef bears is that the penalty a lot of the times for this detective work that solicitors now need to undertake has a criminal sanction against it. So, for example, if you've not done money laundering checks, you've done the checks, but nothing's come up or you've missed something, there is a criminal penalty. You could face a sartorial sentence, a custodial sentence. You could face going to jail, to prison for this. And I'm not so sure that's quite fair. So there's a balancing act between accountability, because obviously if something comes to you, you're the expert, you're supposed to disclose. But equally, how far does one go? You know, that example that Karishma gave, where you've got to look at someone's right to live in the UK. If they were very clever and they gave you fake residence permits, how are you supposed to know that those are made up fake? You know, but the buck stops with you, the lawyer, because you're the one who hasn't checked, you know, that these people have the right to live. And there is a penalty. So there's either going to be a criminal penalty or some sort of monetary payment for missing the diligence or for getting it wrong. So the solicitors have a lot on their plate, you know, and somebody talked about
it seems like it's become an onerous
position. But here's the thing, why are we expected to do this for free? If I'm spending 2 more hours trying to dig in, like, you know, some sort of detective dog or whatever, just trying to sniff stuff out, why is it that I can't charge for my time? And often you go to clients and you say, look, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, and they're not quite happy with that. Yet we're the ones who bear the brunt of the diligence that needs to be done.
Wow, it just seems to be that we're being pushed from pillar to post, and it's becoming ever more onerous. Before we go back and have a last word with Hamish, Karishma, how do you feel about the fact that when you went into the profession you chose, you thought that it was going to be relatively cut and dried what you were doing, and now you're being, well, I don't know, it's probably more interesting perhaps, but it seems to be expecting you to have a knowledge base that's well beyond where you originally were pointing your prow.
It's definitely a lot different than what you expect, and Juliet talks about the fact that we bear the mess of this, and if there are any punishments, they'll be served to us. And it is incredibly daunting. One of the sort of punishments you can get is to be struck off, and you think, I'm still very young. I've been working 10 years to get to this point, working incredibly hard, and to know that that could be stripped away because I've made an error, or a couple of things have slipped through the cracks. It is really scary, but it just goes back to just sort of taking it a step at a time and being proactive and having checklists so that you can ensure you're not missing anything. And of course it helps. I'm incredibly passionate and I have a great team here. And so I know that, Juliet's got my back, and actually we work well together.
Yes, I tell you what, it is heartening to hear that sort of thing. I very much am of the opinion that, and we've talked about this before, teamwork does make the dream work. I'm glad that the Gunner Cook Massive are all pulling in the same direction. And as usual on these things, and Hamish, if you'd unmute yourself, I'd very much like you if you could please take us home.
Well, it was only a couple of years ago, somebody said to me, Hamish, how on earth can you do the work that you do? Aren't you sort of rather sticking your head above the parapet? And all I'm actually taking on board is I'm taking on board data which is passed through to me. And of course, whatever I do, it's covered by, if there's an error, 99% of all errors that we've ever hit in terms of what we've done have been down actually to errors made by the local government offices, errors made by the council or whatever. So but if we were to sit there all day, and I can imagine if both Juliet and Chris were to sit and think what has been on their shoulders to carry, it would be a very, very sad day indeed. What we see actually is some passionate people who really want to do the best for their clients, and that's so important. And as Juliet has sort of reinforced all the time, get to work with the right people. Those, first of all, have a passion for what they're doing, and they generally want to help you, because those are the people who go to dig the deepest and look after your best interests. And really, due diligence is something that we all want to maintain in terms of what we're doing, particularly when we're recording and making use of data. So, I mean, full marks to the legal team actually for what they actually do, because I think it's absolutely stunning.
Marvelous. All right. Well, look, it only remains for me to say thank you so much to Juliet Babula of Gunner Cook. Thank you so much, Karishma Career, stepping in and being so effervescent today. And of course, Hamish McClay of Such Convey, our Lord and Master, who came up with this whole thing in the first place. And to you out there, thanks for listening. And very much like it. Thank you, Laura. Do comment again in the future. It's useful to know that people are actually getting some benefit from what we do here. And until next time I see you all, keep your head in the clouds, reaching for the skies, but your feet on the ground, and do look after that mental health. Bye-bye now.